Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're digging into a really fascinating historical mystery. And actually, it's not a mystery about what happened in the past, but rather who gets remembered, who gets completely erased, and, crucially, who actually holds the pen when the history books are written. We're going to look at the underlying mechanics of historical memory and uncover exactly why our records have this massive, glaring blind spot. So think about the historical figures you know best, right? Chances are they were the firebrands, the charismatic speechmakers, the ideologues standing up on the barricades. But what about the architects? What about the administrators who actually built those massive organizations, managed the strike funds, and held immense real-world power? Why does our historical record seem to just completely forget these highly influential leaders while basically obsessing over the agitators? Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand this historiographical bias, we're going to look at two massive figures from the early 20th century European labor movement, because they perfectly illustrate history's selective memory. On one side, we have Robert Michels, a really fascinating intellectual and ideological drifter. And on the other, A. Purcell, an incredibly powerful British Union administrator who, well, practically vanished from traditional biographies. Looking at their contrasting legacies is going to show us exactly how history chooses its main characters. Section 1. The trajectory of Robert Michels, the ideological drifter. To understand this whole dynamic, we first need to look at Robert Michels' incredibly complex life. Now, you might actually know Michels from his most famous contribution to political science, which he published back in 1911. He diagnosed what he famously called the iron law of oligarchy. Essentially, he argued that all large modern political parties, even the ones that claim to be radically democratic, will inevitably fall under the control of a bureaucratic regime of party functionaries. It's like a rule of nature for him. And this intellectual weight made him a highly documented, highly scrutinized figure, even as his own political allegiances started to drift drastically. Now, to understand Michels' early drift, we really have to wrap our heads around syndicalism. This was a revolutionary movement that sought to organize social war through direct union action. They completely rejected state power and any sort of parliamentary compromise. And the French syndicalist movement heavily appealed to Michels. He absolutely loved their revolutionary elan, their spirit, their temperament, which he felt was completely lacking in the much more cautious, pragmatic parties of his day. And this brilliantly illustrates the complexity of his life. You see, historians like Zeev Sternhell have famously argued for this direct pipeline from the radical left-wing syndicalism of the early 1900s straight over to Mussolini's fascism, basically using figures like Michels as the key link. But when we look at the source material, it shows us this trajectory wasn't a straight line at all. Actually, Michels moved into a bourgeois liberal phase during the 1910s, well before his notorious alignment with fascism in the 1920s. He was, in a lot of ways, an intellectual without a true home. This quote from 1907 really captures his mindset at the time. He wrote, "The great mass of the proletariat is not intimately attached to the party." That's a huge tell. It reveals his profound skepticism of traditional unionism and party politics. You see, despite his sharp theories, Michels was intellectually isolated. He didn't actually have a real constituency or a massive following of workers. He was very much a thinker observing everything from the outside. Because of this detached perspective, Michels harshly critiqued the German Social Democrats of his era. He felt they were completely overrun with reformism and that they just lacked any real revolutionary courage. He specifically went after what he called their worker bureaucratism. He looked at these institutional administrators and saw them as passive, dry, and way too obsessed with legality over direct action. He essentially despised the exact kind of pragmatic administrator that, well, actually makes large organizations run, which brings us perfectly to our next historical figure. Moving into Section 2, A. Purcell and the TUC, the erasure of the administrator. So A. Purcell represents the absolute embodiment of the pragmatic worker bureaucrat that Michels despised. Yet in a 1926 poll conducted by the Sunday Worker to identify the most popular labor movement leaders, Purcell was voted number 6 by the readers. Number 6. He was sandwiched right in there between famous agitators like Tom Mann and Harry Pollitt. The people at the time knew exactly who he was, and they heavily backed him. I mean, just take a look at this astonishing resume. Purcell was a member of parliament. He was an honorary member of the Moscow Soviet. He was president of the International Federation of Trade Unions. He literally chaired the organization committee for the massive 1926 general strike in Britain. And he moved the resolution that birthed the British Communist Party. So I really want you to ask yourself, How on earth could someone with this staggering level of domestic and international influence completely vanish from traditional historical biographies? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it visualizes the core problem. The barrier Purcell faced was one of academic gatekeeping. History isn't just some objective ledger of facts, right? It is recorded by institutional academics, and they have an inherent bias. They look for specific traits in their subjects, and working-class administrators simply didn't fit the mold. To see this elitist bias in action, just look at this striking quote from Beatrice and Sidney Webb. They were pioneers of institutional history back in 1921. They pointed to the, quote, characteristic psychological imperfections of working-class movements, complaining about a lack of men of distinguished intellect. I mean, wow. This perfectly illustrates why figures like Purcell were totally ignored. Traditional biographers were looking for elite intellectuals, writers, and magnetic personalities, not pragmatic manual workers who spent their lives managing union desks. So the crucial point here is how this erasure actually happened mechanically. We call it the double closure. Purcell's career really flourished in this sort of indeterminate space during the early 1920s. But after the 1926 general strike failed, the political landscape hardened. Purcell was essentially squeezed out. He didn't fit into the new managerial social democracy of the mainstream labor movement, but he also didn't fit into the increasingly rigid, Stalinized communist tradition. So without a political home in either emerging narrative, there was literally no faction left to preserve his legacy. Section 3, the Biographical Blindspot, the Historiographical Double Closure. Let's move to this breakdown and see how this builds into the core synthesis of our explainer. Building on sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's theory, we can clearly see why history absolutely loves the agitator. They're charismatic, they're dramatic, they prioritize ideology, and they write letters and essays that elites can easily document. Therefore, they get remembered. The administrator, on the other hand, is bureaucratic. They prioritize organization and statistics over fiery speeches. They're tied to local institutions, and as a direct result, they are biographically ignored. Michels fits perfectly in the agitator column. Purcell fits the administrator. Ultimately, what we learn from comparing Michels and Purcell is that history isn't simply what happened. It is what institutional elites choose to write down. Academic institutions dictate the historical record, curating the past based on their own cultural and intellectual biases. Basically, the people who write the books prefer subjects who look, think, and write exactly like them. Which leaves us with a really vital question to consider today. As we look at our current political landscape, which is absolutely filled with the loud agitators and quiet organizers, who is actually doing the real work to keep our society running? And 50 years from now, who will the history books actually remember? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember to keep questioning the history you're handed.